They brought the boy up through the service elevators because parades are for victors. Chains clinked against his wrists, heavy links for a prisoner who barely reached a soldier's ribcage. The doors peeled open and sound hit him, tier upon tier of faces, 1,000 throats making the bright, cruel noise of people convinced they understand power. Floodlights turned the sand to molten gold. Above it, banners hung like skinned sunsets. On the high days, where glass drank the glare and gave nothing back, the viceroy lounged with one hand on the arm of his chair and one eye on the ratings. The announcer made a sport of his name by mispronouncing it, stretching Jonah until it became something exotic enough to sell. 12 years old, Terran, caught stealing rations, a novelty offender. The crowd loved novelties. They had come for blood the way people come for dessert. He did not look up to see if the camera found his fear. He looked down to see if the sand would hold his feet. He had walked ship decks and mining corridors and the thin backbones of scaffold towers where wind tried to make bargains with balance. He knew the language of surfaces. The arena floor said it would shift just enough to steal his quickness, but not enough to kill him outright. It said entertainment. It said spectacle. The laughter said the rest. A cage door irised open where the light refused to go. Sound fled inside it. Heat poured out. The first thing that entered the world was a tongue tasting the air the way a musician tastes the room before a note. Then the head came, sleek, black, banded with a blue that wasn't color so much as the memory of depth. Jaws hinged wide enough to regard a boy as a problem that could be solved by geometry. The crowd's noise stopped the way a song stops when the needle lifts. Galvorix. Even in a place built to worship its own cruelty, the name did work. It reminded the veterans of the pit campaigns of Krill, where gravity tried to keep secrets, and this serpent learned to break them. It reminded the children of bedtime threats hissed playfully by parents who had never seen what 1,000 deaths look like when you stack them into a legend. Venom that unstitched nerves. Fangs that read bone like script. Coil strength that made armor opinion. "This is what happens to thieves," the announcer said, and played the crowd like an instrument. "Watch and be generous with your fear." Jonah slipped the chains off his wrists as if shedding an old shirt. No guard stopped him. Permission was part of the joke. He moved to the center of the light and sat cross-legged, palms open on his knees, spine long. It wasn't defiance. It was a shape he'd made in cramped bunks and cold corners when panic had too much to say. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Count the air like coins. Spend nothing you can keep. The serpent flowed forward, motion so clean it made machines look clumsy. Sand hissed under its weight. Cameras zoomed until the world became a wedge of muzzle, a boy's lashes, the glitter of a drop of venom falling like a star and cooking a pinhole in the floor. The collective breath of the arena went shallow and stayed there, pressed flat under anticipation. Jonah tilted his head, a small listening, as if waiting for a cue only he could hear. The snake swayed. He swayed with it, not a mirror, a translation. A coil tensed. The crowd leaned. Somewhere, the viceroy lifted one finger to signal the timing of the music that would drown out the sound of a child ending. The strike did not come. Galvorix's head hung above the boy like a blade deciding whether to believe in gravity. The tongue flicked, tasted oiled metal from the rails, dust from old nights, the thin tin of fear soaked into shield glass, every flavor but the one it expected from prey. The boy's pulse did not drum the panic rhythm. His breath did not stutter. No terror sweat glittered along his hairline. The serpent's pupils narrowed, widened, narrowed. Heat vision offered a universe of bodies, each a bright furnace. This small one burned differently. Controlled, steady, like a coil banked on purpose. A hiss stirred the sand between them, not threat so much as question. Jonah didn't answer in words. He lowered his gaze so he would not stare like a rival, and raised one hand until his palm hovered over the scale between the eyes, close enough for breath to touch skin. The distance waited to be named. "Please," he said, quiet enough to belong to him alone. Something in the arena shivered that had nothing to do with temperature. Mockery faltered. Laughter, starved of its punchline, found its way out of mouths as coughs and questions. A woman in the 6th tier stopped chewing and forgot her jaw open. A vendor poured too much foam into a glass and watched it run over his knuckles and drip unremarked to the floor. Galvorix eased down. Not all the way. Enough that the lid of one ancient eye lined with the rim of the boy's knee. The enormous skull set its weight onto the sand like an altar laid where no priest had expected one. Jonah did not flinch. He let the last inch close by itself and set his palm against warm scale. The arena, which had been designed to drink noise, discovered what silence tasted like. The viceroy stood because sitting insulted the architecture of surprise. He leaned toward the glass until his own reflection blurred into the serpent's. "Shock it," he said, a calm that had been purchased wholesale and rehearsed for decades. Now, technicians did what fear orders. Voltage climbed. Somewhere along the serpent's spine, embedded steel woke and tried to write pain into muscle. Galvorix's flank tightened. The boy's fingers spread as if answering a chord. The serpent did not thrash. The monitors spiked, the serpent's eye half-lidded, like someone tolerating a hand on their shoulder from an acquaintance who hadn't learned boundaries. "More," the viceroy said, and forgot to make it sound like a suggestion. Jonah leaned closer until his mouth nearly touched the cool plane of scale. The camera feeds caught shape without catching meaning. 2 syllables, maybe 3, slipped under the noise gate of the world. Not a command. Children don't give commands to storms. A reminder, perhaps, of something the serpent had not had a chance to forget. A tremor ran the length of Galvorix's body and did not break anything. The collar's light stuttered and died. 1,000 volts found a ground they hadn't been promised and left the flesh they had been hired to bully. The boy's hand stayed where it was. The serpent's breath smoothed into the kind of rhythm living things borrow from the sea when they want to endure. On the 3rd tier, a father who had brought his daughter to learn hardness bent and covered her eyes at the precise moment she lifted her hands to cover his. In the far box, a syndicate bride who had been practicing her smile for months let the corners of her mouth fall and felt her face fit better. A veteran of the pit campaigns whispered the name he had sworn never to say aloud again and found that this time his voice did not shake. Galvorix uncoiled a fraction. Muscle the size of scaffolding shifted, not toward the boy, around him. The loop of body that could have been a trap shaped itself into a fence. The enormous head tipped and nudged Jonah's shoulder with a contact so careful it rewrote the serpent's legend by a measurable degree. The boy made a sound that wasn't laughter and wasn't crying, but would live happily in the house built between them. Above, the viceroy's hand hovered over the manual turret release. He imagined the metals report, the statements, the framing. He imagined what fear would cost if it learned a new object. Turrets, he said anyway, because habit is a species of fate. Perimeter, full kill. Hardware rose on command. Their logic was admirable, their aim correct. The serpent moved like an answer to a question no machine had asked itself. The first turret cleared its housing and met the blunt end of a tail moving too fast to be measured without math. It peeled away from its moorings and fell like a flower made angry. The second spat, a testing burst, and learned that fangs don't have to bite to be useful. A strike took the barrel at the base and sent it pinwheeling into the sand, where it rooted itself like a failed tree. By the third, the algorithm began to understand. It lowered itself back into its hole with the humiliating grace of a soldier who has learned that discretion can be strategic, and that a serpent's patience is a kind of superiority. Jonah slid a hand along the ridge above the eye. Up close, the scales weren't smooth. They were a mosaic of tiny plates, each with a different memory of light. Heat walked through his palm and into his wrist and up his arm and found his heart and asked if it remembered how to keep time. He remembered. He had learned the count in a mine when the ventilation failed and men twice his size had forgotten air could be shared. He had learned it in a barracks where sleep refused to visit the children who had boarded the wrong ship at the wrong station. In, out, hold, release. Give the body a job it can do while the world decides if it intends to help. Galvorix inhaled under his hand and matched him. 1, 2, 3, 4. The metal floor under the sand hummed in sympathy, an old structure remembering it had been poured by hands, not fate. The announcer found his voice because that was what he had been hired to do. He began with bluster and tripped on his own script, then abandoned adjectives and said almost gently, "We are witnessing. We are witnessing." Cameras remembered to be eyes. Feeds split into quads, octets, mosaics. Across 9 sectors, the stream filled kitchens and barracks and bars. A woman in a repair bay stopped aligning superconductors and leaned back against cold metal to steady herself. A cadet watched from a bunk and smuggled hope into the pocket where fear had been comfortable. A child in an orbital school with too much glass copied the shape of the boy's open hand against the sun and felt safer by an amount no curriculum could quantify. The Viceroy's reflection stared back at him, older by several minutes than it had been at the beginning of the hour. He could order gas. He could dim the lights and invent an ending that would make a certain kind of sense. He could hard-cut the feed, but the feed had already learned to make copies of itself the way laughter does when it is real. He lowered his hand and told himself it was strategy, not surrender. In the warm shadow of a body built to write fear into history, Jonah stood. The coil around him loosened enough to offer a path. He took one step, and the serpent flowed to make space, then matched him, a glide you could mistake for obedience if you had never met companionship. He walked another step. The crowd didn't breathe, and then, helplessly, as if born with lungs this minute, it did. He set his palm once more between the eyes and whispered, softer than before, because intimacy, when offered, deserves to be met with smaller sounds. Come with me. The first scream didn't come from the sand. It came from the skybox, thin, puzzled, a technician whose console had just informed him it no longer answered to him. The feed fractured into 1,000 mirrored panes and then stitched itself whole again without asking permission. Somewhere deep in the building, a generator coughed like a liar, caught mid-sentence. The Viceroy lifted his palm for the comfortable choreography of punishment and found the room's sensors not where he had left them. "Seal the floor," he said, but the command fell short of the glass and lay there, panting. Down below, Jonah walked. He didn't stride, didn't play at hero. He stepped through sand that had learned his cadence and flowed away from his ankles as if ashamed of how it had been used. Galvorix went with him, not lording, not looming, shadowing in a curve the way a roof follows a child in rain. A perimeter gate hummed and rose, surprise opening a mouth where a lockdown should have clenched its teeth. The first guard to meet them had his weapon at chest height and his eyes at childhood. He saw a boy and a legend, and the sudden terrible possibility that he did not have to be the kind of man he had spent years rehearsing. He let the muzzle fall. His partner didn't. Galvorix's body moved, no strike, a nudge that put cold steel into warm sand and left it there to consider itself. "Back corridors," Jonah said softly to the serpent, to the air, to his feet, "where the noise is thinner." They took a maintenance hall that smelled of ozone and old oil. Pipes rattled overhead like bones amused at a joke. Cameras swiveled to gawk and then, scandalously, looked away. The serpent flowed around corners the way water prefers to, choosing the most generous path, avoiding breakage because it could. They passed a knot of arena staff frozen mid-flight like birds deciding whether the window was open. Jonah glanced up at them as if checking a chart and said, "Go home." One nodded, the others remembered the way. Alarms tried out a dozen tones and kept none. The building's lungs forgot their schedule, exhaled too long, and dragged air through the underworks as if it meant to take a deeper breath and couldn't quite remember how. In the service shaft, a blast door dropped like a bad idea. The serpent planted and took the weight on its back. Metal sang with embarrassment. Jonah slid under, rolled, and slapped the manual latch with a hand that had no business knowing where it was. The door jolted, reconsidered, and lifted those last dragging centimeters. Galvorix folded through on his belly like an apology for having taken up so much room. "Gas," someone cried in the next corridor, because there is always a gas canister eager to earn its keep. Vents clanked open. Pale mist began its slow, inevitable arithmetic. "No," Jonah said to the serpent, to the mist itself as if veto could be a physical action. He lifted his shirt and pressed damp cloth over his mouth. Galvorix sank lower, scooping the boy into the crook of neck and coil and making a pocket of air with his own bulk. They moved beneath the haze in a tunnel they had invented between body and floor. Jonah's hand found the quick release on a maintenance panel. The serpent's tail tore it away with surgical politeness. The open duct coughed, clean draft, and the mist unrolled backward, offended at being asked to reconsider. By the time they reached the South Service Ring, the palace had split into factions, those still performing loyalty at volume, and those who had misplaced the part of themselves that knew how to cheer for a child's death. An officer stepped into the corridor with a line of soldiers stacked behind him like punctuation. He took one look at the coil, at the boy inside the geometry of safety, and flinched. He didn't step aside. He bowed a fraction without meaning to, the smallest hinge of neck, the best he could do in a hallway full of eyes. Galvarix brushed past with the courtesy of a mountain choosing not to fall. Jonah lifted his hand in thanks, and the officer's chest went tight, because gratitude given to a man who hasn't earned it is a weight and a wedge both. He would feel that pressure later. He would move. The final gate wore more guns than sense. Above it, a mural showed men spearing a serpent that existed only in a painter's grudge. Jonah stopped. Galvarix stopped with him, head tilting, gaze traveling the length of the old lie and coming back to the boy. "We're leaving," Jonah said, and spoke it not only as plan but as permission to anyone within the sound who needed a new idea. A turret shivered, indecisive. Sand settled, somewhere, up in a room that had forgotten how to be in charge. A hand lowered an inch. The gate unlatched. The palace took a breath, and for the first time all night, exhaled without choking on itself. Outside, night had remembered how to be gentle. Heat bled off stone in long sighs. The city's neon washed the street in colors that had never belonged to human tongues. People had gathered as people will when a rumor climbs the stairs faster than fear. They pressed against barricades, craned for the shape of the story, phones held high like little altars hungry for proof. Galvarix stilled on the threshold. The arena behind them exhaled smoke and the sour smell of shame. Ahead lay open air and angles meant for smaller lives. Jonah put his hand against a scale as much for himself as for the serpent. "Easy," he said, as if speaking to the thought of freedom. "Step where it holds." They moved out together. The crowd poured sound into the street, first the thin scream of reflex, then something lower, woven, the tone a room makes when everyone inside it is afraid to be the first to hope. A child's voice cut through, bright as a thrown coin. "Look, he's with the boy." Whoever had taught her grammar would be proud of that preposition. A line of armored carriers idled across the boulevard like a misplaced wall. Their cannons whispered to themselves about trajectories. Jonah walked until he could see the faces behind the slits, sweat-shined, young, obedient to narratives that were failing in their hands. He raised his voice enough to reach the first row. "Don't," he said. "You'll miss." Galvarix lifted, reared, not to terrify, to be seen. The serpent's head rose above the snouts of machines that had been built to find targets and discovered, too late, that target and subject are different animals. The great coil came down, not onto tanks, but around Jonah, a circle within a line of sight, a geometry that said no through action, not argument. For a breath length, history hung between outcomes. A woman in a carrier peeled her hands off the grips. Her knuckles had been white so long she'd forgotten their other color. She thought of a son halfway across the city who fed feral alley cats with stolen milk and told them his secrets. She stood up. It was a small betrayal. It was enough. Beside her, another soldier stood, then another. Weapons lowered. Engines clicked into shy silence. The street tried on a new future and found it fit. The moment tore free of itself and went running. The crowd surged, but not forward. The surge turned into a refrain. Stay back, give room, passed person to person like a bowl of water in a house with fire. Someone began to cry without embarrassment. Someone else laughed, hiccuping laugh sorrow makes when it realizes it's not the only language available. Above, the arena's loudspeakers, which had spent years perfecting the acoustics of humiliation, coughed and delivered a different tone. Thin, unsteady, unprofessionally honest. A voice, the announcer's, unadorned. "If you can hear me," he said, speaking to a city and to his own bones, "make way." Galvarix flowed between carriers as if they were tall grass. Jonah kept a hand on the serpent out of habit more than fear. He looked up once at the squat black eye of a camera and said, because maybe someone far away needed the verb more than the noun, "Listen." They took a side street to avoid a barricade that hadn't learned from its colleagues. In the narrow, a shopkeeper standing in his own doorway with a broom, as if the world could be convinced to behave by tidiness alone, set the broom aside and nodded at them, as if they were customers leaving late. A boy on a balcony held his breath until he nearly fell, and then exhaled so explosively his mother laughed, terror shattered and dissolving into fatigue. Sirens approached and did not arrive. Somewhere, someone clever or newly brave had decided the cleanest way to not escalate was to get lost. Drones buzzed overhead and pretended to be fireworks. For once the pretending worked. They reached the river by a route that had not existed until need drew it on the city's skin. The water moved slow, thick with light. Across it, hills shouldered up like animals settling into sleep. If you were an engineer, you could make a case that the bridge ahead had not been raided for serpents. If you were a boy who had learned to count breaths and ask nicely and refused to participate in the choreography of cruelty, you would try the bridge anyway. Together, Jonah said. Galvorix leaned his weight into the stone with careful disrespect, as if saying to the bridge, "Become more than you were built for, just for a minute." The arch held, offended and secretly proud. They crossed to the far bank and the dark beyond the lamplight, where streets forgot to be straights and turned back into paths. Behind them, the city didn't cheer. It exhaled, long, shaky, relieved, to have found a better ending than the one it had been told to practice. In apartments and bars and guard shacks, people replayed 2 seconds of video over and over. A hand on a scale, a head lowering, the smallest syllables in the universe making room for the largest. On the hill above the river, Jonah paused and looked back. The arena squatted under its lights like a lesson ashamed of the test it had written. The palace's tower that had been designed to spear the sky now seemed like a finger admitting it had pointed in the wrong direction. He touched Galvorix's jaw. The serpent turned his head so that one ancient eye framed the city in its curve. "Come on," Jonah said, voice rough with everything he had not said into microphones. "There's more along the way that needs teaching." They went into the dark without fear of it, a boy and a thing that had been built to make endings, inventing a road the world had not known it kept. They reached the first ridge before the city remembered it still had teeth. Sirens found their voices again. Spotlights clawed at the sky like frightened animals. A gunship tilted over the river and held there, indecisive as a hawk with a conscience. On the hillside below, people gathered in waves, the boldest 3 steps closer, everyone else 3 steps back, like a breath the night kept taking and releasing, unsure. Jonah stood with one palm on Galvorix's jaw and the other shading his eyes from the glare. The gunship's bullhorn snapped open with the old grammar of authority. "Stand down and surrender the specimen," a voice ordered, aiming for iron and landing near exhaustion. "Do not proceed." Galvorix lifted, not to threaten, to see better. The old arena smell still clung to his scales. Heat lifted it into the breeze, the last ghost of a story that had ended in sand. Jonah touched 2 fingers to the serpent's ridge, then turned and stepped down the slope alone until the searchlights took him for a blade of light. "I'm not surrendering anyone," he called up, voice raw and steady. "We're not a danger. We're leaving. Terran," the speaker crackled, distilling a planet into a syllable you could point a gun at, "move away from the asset." "Listen to yourself," Jonah said softly, and the gunship pilot heard it in his headset, as if the boy were sitting in the co-pilot's chair, with mud still drying on his cuffs. "You don't even call him by his name." On 3 million screens the speech-to-text burned and skittered. People watching in kitchens and bars and barracks saw a child tilt his head like he was considering whether to forgive an earthquake. They watched his chest rise and fall with a rhythm they recognized from being alive. They watched the serpent behind him become a shape that made sense in the world, not as a weapon, not as a warning, but as a shelter drawn large. The gunship held its breath and then exhaled. The spotlight ratcheted down to something human. The bullhorn clicked off. A crosswind shoved the craft sideways, and the pilot corrected with hands that hadn't been asked to do anything gentle in months. He made a decision he would later file as mechanical error and privately catalog as relief. The ship drifted backward, then peeled away, making room in the sky where old stories had never left an inch. The announcer, who had fled his booth and found himself in the street without knowing the route he'd taken, arrived at the ridge alone and gasping. He expected to be dismissed, punished, forgotten. Instead, he became useful. He turned his mic back on, unfiltered, face bare to the night, and spoke like a man who had watched his own mouth make a living selling endings and had changed trades on the walkover. "If you're watching," he said to the city, to the world, to the feed stitching every room into one, "lower your weapons, clear a path at North Bridge, let them pass." The sentence moved like water downstairs. Police channels garbled with too many hands talking at once, and through it, something older. Neighbors telling each other how to carry a ladder without braining anyone. In 10 blocks, people rolled dumpsters out of the road and then rolled them back with the solemnity of moving altars. Someone painted a quick mark on the asphalt in chalk, a handprint and a coil, and strangers copied it because it seemed like the right size of prayer. The viceroy tried once more to put the night back into its box. He took the dais in a room that had been engineered to magnify him and spoke into the camera with his best radius of calm. "Citizens," he said, "containment is underway. Do not interfere. The creature is dangerous." On a sliver of screen in the corner of his address, the feed double exposed itself. The serpent shielded a woman who had stumbled on the bridge. The boys set her on her feet and brushed dust from her elbow. A guard knelt without orders and tied a child's loose shoe because his hands needed to do something that would make him like himself. The viceroy's voice went thin against images that did not require persuasion to be believed. Jonah and Galvorix crossed North Bridge in a silence you could hear. Phones stayed low, fingers unwound from triggers as if learning a new joint. Midway, a man in a suit too expensive for these hours climbed a barricade and shouted that this was madness, that monsters know nothing but appetite. Galvorix turned his head then, not to frighten, to look, and the man shut his mouth because being seen by what you fear and not being consumed is a humiliation worth keeping. They descended into the industrial district, where the city kept its old bones. A warehouse had burned the week before and not stopped yet. Wind shoved flame along the roofline, tin screamed and fell, sirens bounced off the walls and missed their own echo. Jonah felt the heat hit his face and turned toward it without asking Galvorix to follow. The serpent shadowed him anyway. Inside, the floor had given up pretending to be flat. Fire licked racks of shrink-wrapped things while smoke wrote its single line on every surface. In the back, under an idiot tangle of beams, a sound, thin, impatient, made all the noise in the universe obsolete. A baby coughed and objected to existence. Jonah didn't think. He ran. Meanwhile, the serpent did the arithmetic of architecture faster than falling. He struck the central beam just hard enough to shift the geometry of collapse away from the corner where a woman crouched over the baby, hands bleeding on splinters, eyes wild enough to cut glass. He lowered his head into sparks like a creature daring fire to argue, and scooped them both out of the wreckage with the curve where jaw became neck, holding them above the floor with the care of a library moving books. Jonah met them halfway and took the bundle with grunted promises he wasn't qualified to make, and kept anyway. Outside, when the mother sobbed into his shoulder and pressed her mouth to the serpent's scale without noticing she had done it, the crowd learned a new noise. Not cheering, not prayer. The sound people make when they witness a future they can inhabit. Phones went up again, not to harvest a spectacle, but to hold a record for the part of themselves that would later insist it had dreamed this. By midnight, the story had outrun the city. Governors called councils, priests called off sermons and told congregations to go watch together someplace with light. Scientists scribbled equations around the edges of still frames, trying to name the mechanics of a jaw gentled for a child. On the carrier orbiting 3 skies away, soldiers watched on a delay and let their hands rest on a table without clenching. On a balcony above the bridge, a woman in a uniform with too many pins unclipped one and put it on the rail. It wasn't surrender. It was punctuation. Jonah climbed the last grade out of the river quarter with his hands still on the old scale and thought, absurdly, about sleep. Galvorix's breath huffed through his hair with the damp warmth of something alive and interested. The boy looked up at the serpent's eye and said, because someone had to keep making small, unglamorous plans, Past the hills there's scrub, then dark. We can rest there. Then we keep going. The serpent blinked once, a slow, old gesture that meant yes in at least one language, and lowered his head until the boy could lean against it without his knees noticing. Behind them, a city that had brought a child to its sand for sport found itself, to its bewilderment, proud. They slept on the far side of the last stanchion where the road surrendered and became path. Dawn came slow, feeling its way around stones. The boy woke with his spine remembering what ground does to children, and the serpent woke like weather. First a stir in the air, then presence. Birds puzzled in the scrub. A fox watched from a safe philosophy. They didn't get the morning to themselves. Convoys rolled up with their engines humbled. No sirens, no horns. A single car in the lead, black and embarrassed, stopped at the line where asphalt turned to dust. The door opened. The viceroy stepped out and made the long walk across ordinary earth in shoes that had not earned it. He looked thinner under sky. The architecture of his rhetoric had not followed him. He stood there with only his hands and a throat, learning the difference between projection and saying something true. Security flanked him and then thought better of it and drifted back until they became men again. Jonah didn't go to meet him. He waited where the serpent's shadow made a small country the size of a boy. Galvorix held still, not coiled, not poised, simply there, with the dignity of a mountain that has learned to listen. The viceroy stopped within a handful of breaths. He didn't know how to look at a child and a myth at once. He chose the smaller target because he was not yet brave. "This cannot stand," he began, and the sentence sounded like an old jacket on a new day. He swallowed and started again. "I was taught power is safety. I made a city keep my fear for me. I called it order. Last night, everyone learned how small that was." He didn't kneel. He tried. He locked at the hips like a man who had never bent for anything but dropped objects and stumbled into a shape that wasn't elegant and was the correct size anyway. "I am sorry," he said, and then discovered he had other words. "We will dismantle the arenas, the collars, the programs that make hunger into sport. I will step down. Let it be recorded. I say this without duress. I say it because a child asked me to use his language, and I prefer it." He lifted his eyes toward Galvorix only when he could do it without flinching. "We harmed you because we could. We celebrated it because we were ashamed of how often we couldn't harm anything else. I will put my name on the first law that forbids it under penalty of being remembered badly by every good mouth in this city." The serpent regarded him. Old intelligence moved behind the bright, glassy surface, a tide under ice deciding where to crack. He lowered his head until it hovered a breath above the viceroy's shoulder, and the guards reached for weapons out of long practice and then halted because practice had new notes. The muzzle touched cloth, careful as night. Breath warmed a man who had grown cold around the edges of his decisions. When Galvorix lifted away, the viceroy's face had the look of someone who has forgotten how to be frightened and is curious who he will be now. The crowd on the ridge, because crowds are part of any honest story, made a sound that did not need to be orchestrated. Someone started to tear a posted arena schedule in half. Someone else took the other half and helped, and soon paper fell like awful snow across a city ready for winter to be over. Announcements followed, fierce in their simplicity. The Colosseum doors were welded open, not closed, so light could learn the interior's corners. The floor was dug up, the sand was loaded into trucks and poured into children's playgrounds across the neighborhoods that provided labor and bodies and cheers out of habit. A committee with no taste for committees voted to plant trees where the gates had been, and 1,000 hands dug at once, some with shovels, some with spoons, borrowed from kitchens because urgency had more energy than logistics. On the steps of the palace, the announcer, no longer an announcer, not yet sure what he would be, set up a folding table and handed out permits written in big letters. Sanctuary. People took them like seed packets and walked away grinning in the sheepish way of those who have found themselves unexpectedly useful. It should have ended there, with a new law, a public apology, a serpent and a boy disappearing into landscape. It didn't. Stories that stop at ceremonies are lies of omission. The unthinkable thing was not that a beast made for murder had lowered its head for a child. That had happened in the bones of the world before, We had just forgotten the vocabulary. The unthinkable thing was what came next. The city proved it could keep its promise. In the weeks that followed, the mark began appearing. On doorways, on ferry pilings, on helmets, on the backs of hands, a spiral with an open palm at its center, chalked or carved or painted in the color of whatever you had. It meant, here, we listen first. In such places, brawls paused long enough for someone to fetch water. Patrols learned to ask names before charges. A woman found a nest of alley serpents under her stoop, and, instead of screaming, sat on the stairs and hummed until they unwound and went elsewhere because there was no reason to stay. Children took to touching their chests twice when scared, then breathing, then saying what they needed out loud. It worked more often than your cynicism would guess. Jonah stayed long enough to watch the first sapling take root on the old arena floor. He stood in the half-shade of new scaffolding and let city workers show him their blisters and tell him their names. He let the announcer, who had slept for a day and woken speaking in a different register, teach him how to use a mic to invite rather than inflame. He ate an orange someone pressed into his palm and cried because oranges on his planet did not look like this. On a morning that smelled like wet concrete and promise, he pressed his brow to Galvarix's and whispered something private and small. A thank you, not to the serpent, but to the part of the boy who had sat down in the sand and believed he could be bigger than fear. Then he climbed the ridge and turned his face towards scrub and road and the horizon that had been waiting the entire time. "You're leaving?" the former viceroy asked, not to claim, but because he needed to understand the shape of enough. "We've taught what we could here," Jonah said. "There are other places that still think laughter belongs to cruelty." "Will you come back?" the announcer asked, voice not yet sure what job it was doing. "When you don't need me," Jonah answered, and grinned, and looked 12 again. Galvorix's body uncoiled with the patience of a cathedral opening its doors. He slid into the bright with the boy at his side, both of them neither tamed nor wild, simply allied. They moved between stones and into low brush, away from fences and toward the kind of map that draws itself under your feet when you walk with intention. Up above, a skein of courier drones banked to follow, and then, sheepishly, peeled off. Not because of a protocol, because it felt wrong to interrupt a road inventing itself. At the edge of where the city stopped pretending to be anything but land, Jonah looked back. The river hoisted night shadows out of its shoulders and glittered. On the hill in the distance, a tree the size of a child's courage leaned into a wind that had decided to be kind. People on bridges were pointing, not in alarm but to make sure the person next to them got to see. He lifted his hand not to wave goodbye, to signal the count. In, out, hold, release. Galvarix matched him. The world around them, in ways both visible and not yet measurable, did too. And then the two of them were smaller and smaller still, and then not gone, just part of a horizon that had learned a better story and was eager for a sequel.